You can find almost anything on the internet. And that's true also of social media. If there's an interest or a gripe that you have, you can find information about it to aggravate you or to calm you or to encourage you or whatever. And one of the things that there seems to be a huge surplus of on social media are experts. Experts in everything. Experts in wellness, experts in medicine, and these days, experts in government are a big group. And one of those groups, one of those subgroup, I guess, is people who are sure they know exactly what ICE is allowed to do and what they can't do. These people have watched clips online, they've heard stories from friends, they've watched shaky cell phone videos that start halfway through an encounter and end right before the explanation. And somewhere along the way, many people come to the same conclusion, or one of two conclusions, I guess. Either ICE can do almost anything at once, or ICE can't do much of anything at all. And both ideas are wrong. So this week we're going to talk about one thing above the others, to slow all of that down and clarify what ICE is actually allowed to do and what is explicitly not allowed to do and what the Constitution still requires. Even when enforcement is aggressive, even when politics are heated, even when fear is doing a lot of the work for government. Now, if you know me, you know this is not going to be a defense of ICE by any stretch of the imagination. It's not a blanket condemnation either. It's meant to be a reality check, because when people don't know the rules, power quietly stretches. And when power stretches without any resistance, it rarely snaps back on its own. So we're going to talk about the real law, the real court cases, the real limits, and the very human cost of pretending that those limits don't exist. Hello, everybody. You're listening to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. Today, we're going to be talking about ICE, because that's all that anyone seems to be thinking or talking about right now. There are some misconceptions out there about what ICE can and cannot do. So, I'd like to go through some of it in hopes of getting everyone on the same page. Yeah, right. We have as much chance of everyone getting on the same page as I do of giving up sarcasm as a New Year's resolution. But nonetheless, information is power, and it's all about power these days. But before we do that, let's hit some hot topics. All right, so let's jump right in. We'll talk about Stephen Miller. You've heard the name, unless you've been living in a cave, and you've probably seen clips of him on television. Maybe you've read something about hardline immigration policy, but do most people really understand who he is or why he matters? Too often he's portrayed as some random White House aide with tough talk and aggressive tweets, but that is not all he is. Some believe Miller is simply a loyal Trump advisor doing his job. Others see him as the brains behind the hardest line policies of this era. So, I want to explain exactly why critics, and not just liberal critics, but some centrists and even people inside the Republican Party, view him as a dangerous influence on the president. Not because he's loud, but because his ideas have shaped policy and shifted government power in ways most people don't see until the consequences actually hit home. Stephen Miller currently serves as White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, a role that puts him squarely in the driver's seat on immigration, border policy, and even cultural fights over diversity initiatives and federal hiring policies. This is not a ceremonial title. It's a role that shapes legislation initiatives, executive actions, and enforcement priorities across all of the federal agencies. Critics have described Miller as someone who uses fear and rhetoric to push sweeping changes that go well beyond traditional conservative policy. Jonathan Chait put it bluntly in The Atlantic when he characterized Miller's approach as one that equates opposition with existential threat, essentially framing any political dissent as a kind of terrorism, deserving pushback from the state. That, my friends, is not normal politics. That's something much sharper. Now, to understand his influence, you've got to understand the man, at least as much as we can. Miller first entered political circles as a young, ambitious policy aide in Congress, working for high-profile conservatives like Senator Jeff Sessions, and eventually joining Trump's presidential campaign back in 2016. Even then, his focus was laser sharp on immigration. But what made Miller different from other advisors was not just what he pushed, but how he pushed it, with max aggression and minimal concern for anything like political backlash. He didn't just advocate for tough immigration reform, he framed immigration as a threat to the very fabric of the nation. This worldview has been documented in reporting tracing his ideological evolution and the consistent role immigration played in his policy work, and you would have to be blind to not notice that this thought process of immigration as a active threat has been adopted by many, many people in the United States. And from the beginning, Miller didn't just whisper in Trump's ear. He often controlled the narrative. According to reporting from the Press Democrat, colleagues have said that Miller had singular control over migration policy, meaning he effectively dictated how agencies like Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, the State Department, and the Department of Homeland Security would operate. Think about that for a moment. One advisor shaping tactics and priorities and enforcement strategy across entire federal agencies. And of course, one who was not elected to any office. One of the most controversial pieces of policy linked to Miller, and one that first brought him to national infamy, was the Muslim travel ban, backed and encouraged by Miller during the first Trump administration. Although the Supreme Court narrowly upheld the ban, it still raised alarm bells because it targeted countries with predominantly Muslim populations and was viewed by many as cloaked discrimination. Miller also pushed repeatedly to slash refugee admissions and protections like DACA for Dreamers and restrict legal pathways for a wide range of immigrants. Reporting by multiple outlets, including investigative accounts of leaked emails and things early in his career, showed Miller routinely promoted material from white nationalist and anti-immigrant sources in shaping policy discussions. That's not tough talk. That's the ideological shaping of policy. And if those reports are accurate, it's not an ideology that most Americans would want shaping anything. So let's get into what Miller actually says when he explains his worldview. In an interview highlighted by AP News, he spoke out about global affairs in language that treats the world like a battlefield where strength and force govern outcomes, and dismissed concerns about conflicts with allies or international norms or anything like that. He also weighed in loudly on issues like birthright citizenship, calling the constitutional guarantee of birthright citizenship absurd, and implying that children born in the U.S. to undocumented parents could give rise to welfare access and political influence he views as undesirable. That kind of rhetoric has bled into policy priorities. When a top White House advisor is promoting ideas that directly question established constitutional rights, not to mention long-standing legal frameworks, that's not just argument, that's influence. A lot of criticism of Miller comes from the left, but it isn't confined to just from that direction. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker publicly declared that Miller is enabling Trump by pushing population-wide policies and taking advantage of what he described as the president's diminished capacity. Now, we can argue about that one at a later date, but the point still stands. Earlier reporting also noted that groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center labeled policies shaped by Miller as racist and draconian. Even in conservative circles, there has been concern that Miller's influence stretches beyond regular policy debates and into reshaping the role of the federal government and pushing it into areas that were previously considered beyond the scope of immigration enforcement. That one is a shout out to all of you folks who for years have been saying that they don't like government big and they don't want it infringing in places where it shouldn't. Now, all of this stuff isn't just abstract or theoretical. When someone with Miller's worldview holds such heavy sway in policy decisions, refugee caps get slashed to historic lows, and this of course has real consequences for families fleeing violence and persecution. Deportation priorities have expanded. That's not news. Even people with no criminal history can find themselves targeted under these broad definitions of, quote, public safety threat, end quote. Asylum proceedings become harder to navigate. Legal protections get narrowed and procedural safety nets get weakened. These are the people who are trying to do it, quote, the right way, as we've been told folks should always do. And federal agencies shift missions. Agencies once designed to protect individuals' rights now prioritize enforcement at all costs. And many reports suggest that Miller is the one who is encouraging using military force domestically under broad interpretations of presidential power, a strategy with serious legal and ethical implications playing out right now around the country. Now, here's an interesting twist. Critics and some experts argue that despite Miller's considerable power and influence, some of his most ambitious policies are actually failing. Not because, for any lack of zeal on his part, but because they defy existing legal and constitutional restraints. For example, some courts have blocked parts of the sweeping deportation plans, and routine functions of immigration agencies are become more and more politicized every day, and hopefully less effective as a result. But even so, Miller's presence ensures that immigration and enforcement are continually pushed further towards the harsh end of the policy spectrum. Now, you might be thinking, I'm not an immigrant, why does this matter to me? It matters because this isn't just about border policy. It's about how a single advisor's worldview can influence entire government priorities and push constitutional norms towards something much more authoritarian, more exclusionary, and less predictable, above all. When someone consistently argues for extraordinary measures under the guise of security or cultural defense, the real danger isn't just the policy itself, but the precedent that it sets. So Stephen Miller is not just another voice in the White House. He has shaped some of the most controversial, far-reaching policies in recent U.S. history, and he's doing it with a worldview that many legal experts and civil rights groups and politicians on both sides of the aisle find deeply concerning, from travel bans to attempts at rewriting constitutional guarantees, from mass deportation blueprints to cultural scorched earth politics. Miller's influence on Trump's America is profound, and that influence has to matter. It's one thing to have a law and order policy. It's quite another to shape enforcement in a way that undermines long-standing legal and moral foundations of our free society. Despite how it might sound, this segment wasn't supposed to be all about partisan heat. It's supposed to be about power, influence, and impact. And Stephen Miller's record and rhetoric offer a stark example of what happens when an aide becomes an architect and policy becomes philosophy. All right, let's take a small break here between serious segments and talk about something that is very, very hard to be serious about. We're about to dive into a moment in recent history that is so patently absurd, so perfectly emblematic of the Trump presidency that it almost defies disbelief. President Trump recently sent a letter to the Prime Minister of Norway. Yes, Norway, not Denmark, complaining about not receiving the Nobel Prize. Because, according to him, stopping 8 wars plus somehow qualified him for this honor. Now let's pause for a second. 8 wars plus. By all credible counts, the wars he referenced were not actually stopped by him. Some were winding down, others he escalated, and a couple he just ignored entirely. But in Trump world, facts are optional, reality is negotiable, and ego is the only thing that's really mandatory. So anyway, the letter starts with a subtle but telling shift in mindset, because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize. Trump declares that he, quote, no longer feels an obligation to think purely of peace. Okay, let that sink in. We're supposed to take comfort in knowing that the man running our foreign policy has his moral compass directly tied to whether or not the Nobel Committee likes him. Okay. The concept of duty, of strategic thinking, of rational diplomacy, not to mention national security, apparently all subordinate to ego and gratification. And then the pivot, Greenland. Suddenly, Greenland is at the center of global security. Why? Because Denmark cannot protect that land from Russia or China, so Trump says. And because, in Trump's view, Denmark doesn't really own Greenland anyway, historical voting rights aside, let me explain this for our listeners who aren't geography buffs. Greenland is an autonomous territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. It has its own government, handles most of its own domestic affairs. Denmark takes care of defense and foreign policy, sure, but the idea that a few historical ships mean Trump has a moral claim is, well, it's bonkers. Trump goes further. He asserts that NATO should do something for the United States. Because, according to him, he has done more for NATO than anyone since its founding. Now let's just consider that for a moment. NATO is a 31-member military alliance. It's based on collective security, on cooperation. It is not a fan club handing out trophies for ego inflation. But again, in Trump world, apparently everything is transactional. He does something for you, so you owe him. That's how he thinks the world should work. Then comes the kicker. He declares that the world is, quote, not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland, end quote. Complete and total control. Now, I want to emphasize this because it bears repeating. The security of the entire planet depends, in Trump's mind, on the United States owning a giant frozen territory that already has its own government. This isn't just an overreach. It's a combination of fantasy, hubris, and well, ice and snow. So what was the reaction from the international community when Trump says, I didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, so you have to give me Greenland? Politicians, journalists, and the general public were all understandably shocked. Denmark, politely but firmly, said no. Norway didn't even respond directly. They just mustered polite confusion. Congressional leaders on both sides called the idea bizarre and delusional. A few late-night shows had a field day, jokingly suggesting renaming Greenland the Trump Ice Kingdom, or proposing that we install a gold-plated golf course in Nook where, while we're at it. And honestly, I'm not sure the jokes are even exaggerations. Meanwhile, Trump's letter has a curious combination of paranoia and entitlement. He's essentially saying, I did so much for world peace, 8 wars plus, so now I'm owned a frozen island. The letter reads less like a diplomatic communication or an official letter from the leader of the free world, and more like a teenager negotiating a curfew with their parents. I've been good. You need to give me what I want. Let's zoom out for a moment and explain why Greenland doesn't need to be ours to protect U.S. national security. I've mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. Greenland is massive, about 2.1 million square kilometers. Most of it is ice. The U.S. already has strategic military bases in Alaska, and we monitored the Arctic region with satellites and drones and radar systems. Russia and China are tracked constantly. Greenland's strategic importance comes from geography and resources, but that doesn't mean we need to own it. Control over Greenland isn't a prerequisite for safety. It's just an exaggeration in a letter designed to flatter a fragile ego. This also highlights a pattern we've seen repeatedly with Trump. Complex international issues are reduced to personal vendettas and, again, transactional thinking. The Nobel Peace Prize snub triggers a national security rationale. Denmark's sovereignty is irrelevant to his feelings of being underappreciated. NATO's decades of cooperation are suddenly measured against his personal recognition. This man literally equates a prize he didn't receive with a global defense strategy. This is ego-driven fantasy. And the letter ends, of course, with a polite thank you, as if the act of writing it somehow validates his claims. It's almost endearing in a weird sort of way if you don't think about the fact that this is coming from the President of the United States. Some more reactions from U.S. politicians. Senator Mitt Romney, no stranger to calling out Trump, said the notion of buying Greenland was not a serious proposition. Meanwhile, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi called it bizarre and detached from reality. I think that was pretty kind. Even members of Trump's own party struggled to frame the letter without laughing. And of course, the press had a field day. Headlines included everything from Trump wants Greenland because he didn't get a medal to President discovers new reason the world needs him. And yet, Trump supporters, or at least many, many of them, cheer him on. To them, this is just another example of Trump being tough on the world. Never mind that no one else sees it that way. In Trump world, the world revolves around ego, attention, and symbolic victories. Greenland becomes not a landmass or nation with actual people, but a shiny object in the trophy case of Trump's self-image. Now, imagine if this logic were applied to other countries. France doesn't give Trump recognition for, a Paris visit. Suddenly, Paris must be ours. Japan doesn't applaud him for his trade policies. Tokyo is next. That's the slippery slope we're talking about, and that's exactly why this letter, as goofy as it is so useful. It exposes, in vivid technicolor, how Trump thinks, how his ego functions, and why critics are so alarmed by these impulses. Finally, let's address what this says about leadership. Being president is about national security and diplomacy and rational decision-making. Trump's Greenland letter shows us what happens when those things are subordinated to ego. Policy becomes personal. Strategy becomes vendetta. And the world becomes a stage for his validation. That's not the way diplomacy is supposed to work. That's the way a reality TV show works. And somehow, we let the same person handle both. So if we step back, here's the takeaway. Trump's Greenland letter is a perfect storm of fragile ego, historical misunderstanding, and global overreach. It's absurd, it's alarming, and it's undeniably entertaining if you like watching a grown adult write letters like a scorned schoolboy. But it also crystallizes why so many Americans and people here and abroad are wary of his approach to foreign policy. Ego and personal grievance should never dictate strategy for a nuclear power. And yet, here we are, reading a letter about how the world isn't safe unless Trump gets his way with the ice island. And that's how you get from a Nobel Peace Prize snub to imagining the United States owning Greenland. One ego, one delusion, and one very polite but firm no from Denmark. Now, before we get to the main topic, I have one more hot topic here, but it ties in very nicely with our main topic. And this is a story of a journalist by the name of Laura Jadid. This is something that should alarm everyone, regardless of where you stand politically on immigration policy. Not just because it's about ICE or immigration or enforcement, but because it's about how a federal law enforcement agency is recruiting, vetting, and apparently handing out badges. And if the integrity of that process is weak, as we suspect it is, the consequences ripple outward into every community, every case, and every person ICE encounters. So, a few months ago, a journalist, Laura Jadid, who is a military veteran, a freelance reporter, and a vocal critic of the Trump administration's immigration policies, decided to put the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement recruitment process to a test. She wasn't trying to expose a policy she disagreed with. She was trying to see if the system actually did what they claim it does. If it actually vetted applicants seriously, if it screened for character, background, alignment with mission, or if it was just moving badges out the door. And what she found, or didn't find, is shocking. At a career expo in Arlington, Texas in August of 2025, Jadid showed up like a normal applicant. She walked the booths, talked to recruiters, and eventually sat down for an interview. But here's the kicker. The interview lasted 6 minutes. 6 minutes. That's shorter than a first date at a fast casual restaurant. And what was discussed? Her name, her date of birth, her military history, and that was it. Now let's pause for a second. This wasn't a volunteer position at a weekend festival she was applying for. This was an interview, a formal step for a federal deportation officer role in one of the nation's most controversial law enforcement agencies. An agency with the authority to detain people, execute removals, coordinate enforcement operations across states, and interact heavily with everyday civilians. In 6 minutes, an applicant's entire suitability was ostensibly assessed and apparently approved. This wasn't just a handshake and a business card. On September 3rd, 2025, the agency listed Jadid's status as entered on duty in its internal system. Her USA Jobs portal, the official federal hiring platform, showed not a provisional expression of interest, but paperwork for a final offer, an onboarding date of September 30th, 2025, and a duty station of New York City. In short, the system looked like a job was waiting for her. And yet, here's where it gets even stranger. She never signed a single piece of agency paperwork. She never provided any of the required forms. She never submitted a domestic violence affidavit, a standard part of background checks for law enforcement positions. She didn't even provide authorization for a background check or identification details in the official system. Let that sink in. Federal law enforcement agencies require background checks for a reason. The most basic step, permission to review your criminal history, was never provided. The department couldn't even technically start a background check. Yet, the internal status still showed her as an employee. And here's another layer. She admitted on video that she had used cannabis before she was supposed to take a drug test. That's not a technicality. For almost every law enforcement agency in the country, a recent drug use disclosure is a red flag, if not an outright disqualifier. But the hiring process just kept moving forward. Now, of course, all of this comes at a time when ICE is under intense pressure and scrutiny. If you look at the reporting on the administration's stated goals, including mass deportations and expanded arrest authority and increased enforcement resources, it's clear that ICE has been told to push hard, boots on the ground. And that's where critics see the deeper problem. Prioritizing guns and badges over thorough screening and readiness. The report from Jadid didn't just rely on her testimony. She shared visual evidence, screen grabs from her USA Job portal showing the final offer letter and onboarding details. That visual countered the Department of Homeland Security's official response, which was to label the claim that she made as inaccurate and to frame a tentative selection letter as nothing more than preliminary paperwork. DHS essentially said this is just an initial step, not a final job offer. But the on-screen evidence did not look preliminary. It looked official. It showed job details that you only see when the hiring process is complete. That contradiction matters because it raises questions not just about how the employees are vetted, but how the agency communicates and records hiring decisions. So, who is Laura Jadid? She's not just some random person trying to stir up trouble. She's a 38-year-old freelance journalist and a former U.S. Army service member with 2 tours in Afghanistan. She's also been publicly critical of ICE and its policies for years, enough that anyone recruiting for ICE should have seen it with a simple Google search, or a quick review of her public social media. If the agency's vetting process really worked at all, her public criticism of ICE should have registered somewhere in the hiring review process. Yet it didn't. Is it actually possible that ICE is skipping the most readily available and potentially insightful view into an applicant's personality and positions, their social media presence? Now let's zoom out for a moment. Why does this matter to you, someone who might never work in immigration, might never interact with ICE directly, and might think this is just another media stunt? Because law enforcement agencies, federal, state, local, they have real power. The confidence you have in them depends on one fundamental assumption, that they do due diligence before they put guns and authority into someone's hands. If that vetting process is weak, if a 6-minute chat is enough to move someone that close to hiring, if background checks are skipped, if drug tests are ignored, then we're not dealing with the edge case. We're dealing with a system that is fundamentally out of alignment with how responsible public safety recruitment is supposed to work. And ICE doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has operational reach across cities and states. It interacts with local police. It detains people in facilities across the country. It its officers execute warrants, make arrests, coordinate enforcement that touches millions of lives. And, as we've seen lately, these enforcement tactics can escalate into situations where things get violent. If the threshold for entry into this organization is as weak as it appears in Jadid's case, that's a problem for everyone, not just immigrants or journalists or critics. Now let's talk about the DHS response for a minute, because it's part of the picture. When the department was confronted with these findings, it didn't say, "We take this seriously and we'll investigate our hiring procedures." It didn't say, "We agree more needs to be done." Instead, DHS chose to wave it off as a misunderstanding, calling a final offer letter a tentative selection letter, and suggesting the process was always preliminary. But the problem isn't just a difference in wording. The problem is that language is being used to narrow perception, not clarify it. That's a classic bureaucratic tactic. Downplay a problem with labels so that scrutiny loses steam. Contrast that with agencies like the FBI or the Secret Service or DEA, where background checks, character evaluations, fingerprinting, psychological screening, and drug tests are non-negotiable parts of the hiring pipeline. Those agencies lose candidates all the time for a failed drug test or a missed form or a minor discrepancy in paperwork. That's not because they want fewer employees. It's because they recognize the risk of putting people in positions of authority without thorough vetting. To be clear, ICE is not the only agency with hiring headaches. Every federal agency competes for talent, and every agency has its own internal pressures. But what sets this apart is the combination of aggressive policy targets and apparently lax vetting standards. When you tell an agency to get boots on the ground and then show so little interest in who those boots belong to, it prioritizes numbers over integrity. That's not just a personnel issue. That's a policy issue. That's a public safety issue. That's a credibility issue. And that's why journalists do what they do, not because they want to tear institutions down for fun, but because institutions should operate in a way that earns public trust, not chips away at it. So what do we take from this investigation? Here are, I think, the key points. 1. The vetting process for ICE recruitment, as documented by Laura Jadid, appears to be weak and potentially incomplete. A 6-minute interview, missing paperwork, no background authorization, and continued processing despite cannabis admission are red flags in any responsible hiring process. The internal systems designation of entered on duty and the USA Jobs Portal offer indications that the agency believed it was processing a final hire, even if DHS claims otherwise. That contradiction matters. The DHS response focuses on semantics, calling a final offer tentative rather than addressing the procedural gaps in the vetting process. That's not reassuring. And 4, if federal enforcement agencies roll out mass hiring with weak oversight, the problem isn't just efficiency, it's accountability. Accountability safeguards both the public and the agency from abuses and errors and misalignment with statutory missions and regulations. This story isn't about one person, it's about that system. And that system needs scrutiny, not spin. And maybe that's the final snarky truth here. If you can get hired into a federal law enforcement role with less vetting than it takes to be a barista at your local coffee shop, we might want to rethink who gets entrusted with authority that can literally disrupt people's lives. Because the difference between a coffee order gone wrong and a deportation order gone wrong is the difference between a bad morning and a life-altering consequence. So yeah, that's why this matters. So on to our main topic for this week. What ICE can and cannot do. So let's start here. Immigration enforcement is one of the most emotionally charged issues in American politics today. It sits at the intersection of fear, identity, race, economics, and power. That alone makes it fertile ground for misinformation. But there's another reason confusion thrives here. Immigration law is civil law enforced by criminal-style policing. That mashup creates gray areas where people assume the government must have broader authority than it actually does. ICE is a federal law enforcement agency. It carries guns, it makes arrests, it detains people, but it is still bound fully and completely by the U.S. Constitution. Not when convenient, always. So what follows here now is sort of a walkthrough of some ICE encounters, the way they actually happen on sidewalks, at doors, in cars, at work, and in moments where people are scared and unsure. And along the way, we'll ground this in some real Supreme Court cases, federal rulings, and documented enforcement failures. So let's start off with public encounters. What ICE can and cannot do. ICE agents, like other law enforcement officers, can approach people in public spaces. Sidewalks, parks, parking lots, store aisles. These are all areas where the government does not need a warrant to simply initiate a conversation. That's the part people often misunderstand. An agent walking up to you and asking you questions is not by itself a violation of your rights. But here's the pivot point. Conversation is not detention. You are not required to answer questions. You are not required to produce documents unless legally required by a specific statute. And you are free to walk away unless the agent has reasonable suspicion or probable cause to detain you. This is where racial profiling has repeatedly entered the picture and repeatedly failed in court. In the United States versus Brignoni-Ponce, the Supreme Court made it unambiguous. Apparent Mexican ancestry, or by extension, looking foreign, does not create reasonable suspicion. Accent does not matter. Language does not matter. Skin tone does not matter. ICE has lost cases for relying on exactly those factors. DHS's own Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties has documented stops where agents cited nothing more than appearance combined with presence in a so-called high immigrant area. Courts have consistently rejected that logic. Looking foreign is not evidence, it's bias. Reasonable suspicion versus probable cause. This distinction matters more than almost any other. Reasonable suspicion is a lower standard. It allows brief detention, a stop, based on specific, articulable facts. Probable cause is higher. It's required for an actual arrest. Neither standard allows vibes. Probable cause requires fact that an officer could later explain to a judge without relying on any stereotypes or guesses or gut feelings. That might include confirmed immigration records, a final removal order, a direct admission from the person, or some other sort of verified information. It does not include annoyance. It does not include rudeness. And it does not include they looked like they didn't belong here. Speech and profanity and retaliation. This one is personal for a lot of people. Yes, you can swear at ICE. You can insult them. You can yell. You can tell them exactly what you think of their job. That is freedom of speech. In City of Houston v. Hill, the Supreme Court affirmed that verbal criticism of police is protected speech, even if it's crude, loud, or disrespectful. Speech does not create probable cause. Speech does not create reasonable suspicion. And speech does not magically turn a voluntary encounter into a lawful detention. What speech can do is irritate officers. And irritation does not equal authority. Now, where ICE most often overreaches. The home is where the Constitution tends to be the strongest. In Peyton v. New York, the Supreme Court held that law enforcement cannot enter a home to make an arrest without a judicial warrant. Immigration enforcement does not get an exemption. Despite this, ICE has repeatedly relied on administrative warrants. These are documents signed internally, as in internally within ICE, not by judges, to pressure people into opening doors. In multiple federal cases following 2019, courts emphasized that administrative warrants do not authorize home entry. Consent obtained through misrepresentation is also not valid consent. If an agent lies about their authority to get inside, the entry is unlawful. Now let's talk about vehicles and the idea of obstruction. Vehicles introduce another layer of confusion to this whole mess. ICE can approach vehicles in public. What it cannot do is treat inconvenience as obstruction. A vehicle that agents can walk around, drive around, or otherwise bypass does not justify the removal of the occupant. Obstruction requires material interference, not just annoyance. Courts have been clear. Officer inconvenience does not equal exigency. Ordering someone out of a vehicle is a seizure. It requires legal justification. Without a lawful stop, there is no automatic authority to remove an occupant. And if the lawful stop is based on officers being annoyed by the person, then it is not a lawful stop. How about businesses? Businesses are private property open to the public, and that distinction matters. ICE may enter public-facing areas during business hours. They may speak to customers or employees voluntarily. They may not enter non-public areas such as kitchens or stockrooms or offices without consent of the owner or a judicial warrant. In INS versus Delgado, the Supreme Court held that questioning workers is not detention only when workers remain free to leave. Coercion changes everything. Businesses are not required to help ICE. Over-cooperation has led to lawsuits for discrimination and wrongful disclosure. Now, to jump back to our previous segment, let's talk about training, vetting, and enforcement culture. We need to talk about why some of these violations keep happening. Multiple DHS Inspector General reports have found shortened training pipelines, inconsistent constitutional instruction, and weak supervision and minimal accountability for rights violations. When political leadership frames enforcement as a numbers game, constitutional caution then becomes an obstacle to them. That's how agents begin to believe that irritation equals authority and confusion equals consent. And let's be honest, most of the abuses that happen are not the dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones. A door opened because someone didn't know they could say no. A car search consented to out of fear. A workplace cooperation that crossed legal lines. That's how things start to erode. Not with announcements, but with silence and miscommunication. Now, let's slow this all the way down and walk through a scenario that mirrors many, many real encounters. Imagine it's early evening. You're sitting at home, maybe you've just finished dinner, maybe the TV's on, and there is a knock at the door. Not a pound, not sirens, just a knock. You look through the peephole and you see two people in plain clothes. One flashes a badge. Here's the first moment where knowledge matters. They say they're with ICE and they want to ask you a few questions. They might say they're looking for someone else. They might say it'll only take a few minutes. At this point, legally, you do not have to open the door. You can speak through the door. You can ask if they have a judicial warrant. You can ask them to slide it under the door or hold it up to the window. If what they have is an administrative warrant, and it often is, it does not authorize entry. Full stop. Now, let's say you're in a different scenario. You're driving. You're not speeding. You're not swerving. You notice a vehicle behind you for a while. Eventually, lights come on. ICE can only stop your vehicle if there is lawful justification. Immigration enforcement alone does not grant random stop authority. If they approach your vehicle, they may ask questions. You may ask if you're being detained. If the answer is no, you may leave. If the answer is yes, they must articulate why. Annoyance is not a why. Now imagine you're at work. ICE enters the public area of the business. They start talking to people. Tensions rise. Managers panic. This is where employees often make things worse. ICE cannot go into employee-only areas without consent or a warrant. Employees do not lose their rights because they are on the clock. Businesses are allowed to say no. Most rights violations happen here, not because the law allows them, but because fear fills in the gaps. This is what enforcement actually looks like. Not a movie, not a raid every time, a series of small decisions made under stress. And that's why clarity matters. So, what do I want you to walk away from this episode with is that ICE is not all-powerful. They cannot enter homes without judicial warrants or real consent. They cannot detain people based on race or appearance. They cannot turn profanity into probable cause. They cannot make inconvenience into obstruction. They cannot outsource enforcement to terrified businesses. Knowing your rights does not make you anti-law. It does not make you anti-law enforcement. It makes you pro-Constitution. And in a moment when fear is being used as policy, clarity is a form of resistance. That's not radical. That's American. For this week's high note, we have the kind of story that doesn't get nearly enough airtime. I feel like I say that a lot with high notes, but nonetheless. The quiet, determined acts of kindness that keep communities alive when fear is knocking at the door. In Minnesota, where all we see on the news these days is violence and chaos, and in other communities across the country, ordinary people are stepping up to ensure that their neighbors aren't left isolated or hungry, even in the shadow of the largest immigration crackdown in recent history. One volunteer, who asked to remain anonymous, described their work simply as neighborly kindness and foresight. But what they do is anything but simple. They spent their days at a local church collecting groceries, toiletries, other essential supplies. Then, with the help of other volunteers, they delivered those items directly to Latino families who, because of reports of ICE agents detaining or harassing people in parking lots, bus stops, and near stores and even schools, were too afraid to leave their homes. Let that sink in for a moment. Families staying home from everyday errands worried that a simple trip to pick up milk or bread could result in detention or worse. This is real fear, and in these circumstances, not leaving the house can mean more than just missing a grocery run. It can mean food shortages, social isolation, mounting anxiety. It can mean wondering if I'm taken, who will take care of my kids? In one particularly moving example, the volunteer drove a legal resident, a U.S. citizen or green card holder, who had been harassed by ICE to meet with a lawyer. Why? To ensure this individual had custody arrangements in place for his children in the event of detention. Now think about that. Parents having to plan for their own potential absence because the systems meant to protect them have become sources of fear. This volunteer helped turn a moment of crisis into a moment of care, giving that family a layer of protection, clarity, and peace of mind. And this isn't just charity. It's foresight. It's neighbors literally watching out for one another when larger systems fail. And the volunteer framed it beautifully. Not as heroism, not as political theater, but as simple human decency. A practical, tangible way to protect family, community, and dignity. Now, this story, as powerful as it is part of a broader wave of community response. In South Minneapolis, for example, the church Iglesia Dios Habla Hoy, which translates to God Speaks Today, has become a hub for mutual aid. According to the senior pastor, they've registered over 24,000 families for support. Thousands of volunteers pack and deliver groceries and toiletries and essential supplies, often working late into the night. They even have wait lists because the need is so overwhelming, and they keep going by the grace of God and by the help of thousands of volunteers. It's not just one church. Across Minnesota and beyond, other faith groups, schools, daycares, food shelves have coordinated very similar efforts. Volunteers load hundreds of bags of food, diapers, hygiene supplies. Local officials, including community services officers from Minneapolis Police Department, have even partnered with pastors to ensure deliveries reach families safely. These are everyday people putting systems in place to help each other when fear has closed doors and emptied streets. Reports from Sahan Journal and other local outlets describe the sheer scale of these efforts. Volunteers work tirelessly to counteract the anxiety and isolation caused by ICE activity, ensuring that families, regardless of their immigration status, have food to eat and resources to survive. It's a quiet form of resistance, but one that speaks volumes about resilience and humanity and solidarity. And let's be clear, these actions are about more than just groceries. They're about stability, about keeping families together, about saying to a frightened child, a weary parent, or a worried neighbor, you are not alone. We are here for you. In a time when policy, feels like a threat, these efforts are the opposite. A shield, a safety net, a reminder that community still matters. The volunteers' work and the larger movement it represents highlights something crucial for all of us. It shows how ordinary people, neighbors, congregations, teachers, volunteers, can step in when systems falter. They show how preparation and compassion go hand in hand, planning for worst-case scenarios, ensuring children are protected, making sure the family has essentials, all while maintaining dignity and respect. And yes, it's worth noting a little humor in the midst of this seriousness. You could picture volunteers in church basements, elbow deep in canned goods, passing around spaghetti and rice like they're in some sort of culinary relay race. One volunteer even joked they could run a small grocery store faster than some of the big chains right now, minus the lines and screaming toddlers and the occasional cart collision. But underneath those jokes, there's something profoundly moving. People give their time, energy, and hearts, not for headlines, not for fame, but because they know that when a community looks after its own, everyone benefits. And in that lies the feel-good magic of this story, because for every policy designed to divide or intimidate, there's a volunteer quietly driving someone to a lawyer, or delivering groceries to a doorstep, or checking in on a neighbor. For every report of harassment, there's a network of care and compassion and foresight that refuses to let fear dominate daily life. So when we think about resilience, community, and the small acts that ripple out to make a bigger difference, this is exactly the story we want to remember. It's not flashy, it's not the national headline, but it matters. Families eat, kids sleep with a little less worry, and somewhere, a parent breathes easier knowing their community has their back. In a world that often feels fractured and harsh, these acts remind us that hope isn't abstract. It's in the bags of food, the phone calls, the rides to lawyers, the thousands of volunteers saying, "We've got you." And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of news we need to hear more often. Real people, real kindness, real community resilience. And that brings us to the end of another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. Thank you to everyone who took the time to download and listen to this episode. I appreciate it more than I can say, and I would love to hear from you. You can reach out to the podcast via any of the social media platforms that we use. The links to all of those are on the Linktree page, and the address of the Linktree page is in the episode description. You can also reach out via email. The podcast email address is neighborotleftpodcast@gmail.com. I want to hear critiques, I want to hear criticisms, I want to hear compliments, thoughts, whatever. We'll be back on Friday with another installment of Back Porch Files. So until then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.